let's get started. Now that we've got the limbic system entirely under our belts, it's time to learn more about the limbic system, particularly focusing today on interactions between the limbic system and the cortex, and especially the frontal cortex, and especially within that, the prefrontal cortex, interactions between the two. We know the song and dance from earlier this week, the simplistically naif-like belief that everything that goes on with cortex and limbic system consists of the cortex having top-down control over the limbic system. Our theme there, that there's as much going up as going down, as many projections, as many cables, as much white matter going upward as downward, and the interactions between the two being critical. To quote Thomas Hobbes, a limbic system without a cortex is short, nasty, and brutish. And to quote Rousseau, a cortex without a limbic system is heartless. Okay, so what we're going to focus on today is seeing a bit more about what some of the limbic structures do, and then seeing how they interact with the cortex in bidirectional ways. Okay, so we head back into the amygdala. And what we know it's about is fear, anxiety, aggression. Oh, we are going to explore that at such length that the interactions between the brain being afraid and the brain being aggressive is fundamental and centered in the amygdala. We are going to spend tons on that. But now looking at some of the things that really get the amygdala go. First off, the contrast between risk and ambiguity. Here we are, 1 minute into the lecture, and I get to use my magnets already. So here's one situation. You sit someone down, and you say, here inside this barrel that you can't see into, there's 300 blue things and 300 orange salmon things, and reach in there, and here's the deal, just grab one and pull one out, and if it's one of the orange things, we give you a fantastic reward, and if it's one of the blue things, we beat you senseless. Do you want to do it or not? And what you're doing here is, do you want to take a risk on a 50-50 chance? You could skew in the other direction. 500 of them are blue, 100 of them are orange. If you go in there and you get an orange one, we're going to write operas about you. If it's a blue one, we're going to beat you senseless. Do you want to do? These are about risk. And people vary in their risk tolerance. They vary enormously, and they vary as to whether 50-50 or 5-6 or whatever that counts as something tolerable, and it depends on how much of a reward and what mood you're on that day and your dopamine, whatever's, and all of that. What's your feelings about risk? And that does not particularly involve the amygdala. In contrast, now we bring in the subject of ambiguity. Here's what they say. They say, well, here's a barrel and it came 600 thingies, and at least one of them is blue. And at least one of them is orange. And here's the deal. Do you want to reach in there, pull one out, and if it's orange, we love you, and if it's blue, we beat you senseless all over again? Do you want to do that? This is critically different. This is about risk. This is about ambiguity. And what you find is, people have different thresholds for risk, and some people thrive on all that. Ambiguity, people hate. People hate ambiguity, as do lab rats when tested in clever ways, and you get much more activation of the amygdala in an ambiguous situation than one of known risks. And it struck me that the last 4 years has been very heavily about the contrast between risk and ambiguity. Risk, you're going to go get your child vaccinated for polio and Salk or Sabin or whichever one it is these days. You get it vaccinated and you wonder, is there any risk to it? And there's a clear answer. There's like 1 in 13.1 million chance that a polio vaccine is going to cause a case of polio instead. You know the risk. It is clearly there. What the last 4 years about was this virus. What What is it? Where did it come from? How fast is it going to mutate? For years ago, the main thing being how fast can we get a vaccine? Then will people actually take the damn thing? All about ambiguity, because all about every single expert saying, we don't know yet, we don't know yet. And this is much more of an amygdaloid event than risk is. Ambiguity gets the amygdala going like crazy. So does dread. For those of you who have sat at the feet of your great 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 grandparents, almost certainly they were obsessed with Ms. Pac-Man. Ms. Pac-Man back when? And what you see with that is it's some ancient video game thing where you're going around eating stuff and there's big scary things that are chasing you and cornering you. And what you see is if they corner you, they eat you and it's the end of the game or the round or whatever, and you're trying to evade them. And what happens is if you put somebody in a brain scanner and they're playing this Pac-Man, as the mean biting ghosty scary things get closer and closer to you, the amygdala gets more and more active, and when they finally get you, it shuts off. Whoa, what's that about? That is the amygdala being about dread, not about punishment. It's about the anticipation of something awful happening. Aha, you should see that as the mirror image of the dopamine system rather than reward, anticipation, reward. Very frequently, the anticipation of punishment is more aversive to people than is the punishment itself. Enough for A, I can't stand waiting, I can't stand the uncertainty. The dread drives the amygdala like crazy. More examples of uncertainty, ambiguity, things like that. You look at what drives up stress hormone levels, glucocorticoid, cortisol levels. What drives them up in any primate out there is hierarchical instability. When a hierarchy is stable, it is very clear number 3 can do whatever to number 4, but can't do a thing to number 2, so on. And when you see that, when you get a primate hierarchy that's destabilized, when everything is in flux and nobody knows who's standing where with respect to who, you see stress hormone levels soar like crazy. And it's in those circumstances that you see heavy amygdaloid activation. Okay, so ambiguity, dread, instability, uncertainty, the anticipation of bad stuff happening, potentially being more amygdaloidically aversive than the punishment, than the bad thing itself. All of this is embedded in a critical feature of everything with your amygdala and the rest of the limbic system, which is it's social. It's social. If you are playing some sort of game and something called the ultimatum game, for example, which we didn't go into, but is related to prisoner's dilemma, and you're playing against the other person and you're wondering, they have a moment there where they could just savage you, stab you in the back, and you're dreading whether they do that, and you're building up your anxiety about that, all of that, and the amygdala activates. And if instead you believe it's a computer that's deciding whether to stab you in the back or not, you don't get the amygdaloid activation as much. There's something about the sociality, the fact that something animate, something living is doing that to you instead of just some stupid computer that has an algorithm as to when to cooperate and when to cheat. Intentionality in a social context drives the amygdala like crazy. So immediately say, what about Ms. Pac-Man, those little ghosty things with primitive animation? Where on some level, we're processing them in our brains as being animate things, just like when we were 6 months old, and this counted as much more interesting than this. We're projecting animism all over the place, and when we could do it effectively, it carries much more of a punch. Now, this brings in a very interesting feature of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which is anchored in the amygdala. It's anchored insofar as when somebody has gotten PTSD from combat trauma, from sexual violence, from things of that sort, when they've gotten PTSD over the subsequent years to decades, the amygdala gets bigger. And I don't mean like, ooh, there's a few more receptors for this neurotransmitter on dendritic spines. The actual structure of the amygdala gets bigger. You could see it on a brain scan. And it gets bigger, it gets more hyperreactive, it has a lower threshold for responding. It is an amygdala that is seeing threat all over the place because of the intensity of the trauma filed away there. And it turns out, of course, there's a huge issue when somebody gets traumatized. Are they going to get PTSD or not? What the numbers suggest is combat trauma, 15 to 20% of people get PTSD. A singular round of sexual violence, about 15 to 20%. Multiple rounds, 99% essentially. In terms of combat trauma, something we will get to down the line is the fact that drone operators sitting in some nice air-conditioned office at an Air Force base somewhere in Nevada, operating drones, killing people on the other side of the planet, get PTSD as well. And that is something people have been trying to sort out as to what is traumatic about combat trauma. Okay, so PTSD, what are some of the predictors? Who's the 15% who are going to get it? And there's all sorts of risk factors that go into it. If you have adversity in childhood, if you had some neurodevelopmental delays, if you had all sorts of stuff that makes perfect sense in terms of trauma. And I heard a great example of this once where I was like giving a talk at some PTSD unit in Arkansas or something, and they were taking me around the clinic before I had a meet with various people that are hospitalized with your PTSD, and talking to them, and the sort of doc who is taking me around was sort of prompting each person to talk about some of their experiences and what their background was before they went off to war. This was a VA hospital. And every single person you were talking to there with severe PTSD, same thing. I was sexually abused as a kid, and both of my parents were substance abused, and I shuttled through foster homes, and I was knifed for the first time when I was 11, and like the eighth one of these in a row where the person hasn't even gotten to being sent off to Vietnam yet, sitting there going through like this horrendous upbringing. And then afterward, the psychiatrist summarized, you got to realize these boys already had a lot of mileage under the hood before they ever set foot in the military. So those as predisposing factors. But another interesting, very important one as to whether or not people are going to get PTSD out of a trauma is, did it feel intentional? Was it caused by a human intent on causing that damage to you? And what you see is a world of difference in rates of PTSD after directed violence at you versus after an earthquake, after a hurricane, things of that sort. The notion that somebody could choose not to have done that, yet they chose to do that to me especially, to people who look or act or pray like to me just as a random person in the street, the fact that it was intentional increases the odds of PTSD enormously. And what's that about? That's your amygdala sitting there saying, was this a social act or was this an act of God? If it was a social act, was it inadvertent, just like the humans spilling the kibble all over the floor for the chimp, or was it intentional? What was going on? Was there animate human intent in making me this traumatized? That is a huge predictor. And much has been made of the fact that various hurricanes have hit over the years and caused disasters, and they cause a certain frequency of trauma. But you guys are all too young for Hurricane Katrina 23 years ago, something like that, which hit New Orleans and destroyed large parts of New Orleans and because it was a massive hurricane and all of that, but it destroyed only certain parts of New Orleans. The poor neighborhoods, where the levees had been built against the water and not maintained over the decades, where people, 1,000 people approximately, drowned because the government didn't bother sending buses to evacuate the poor people who didn't have cars of their own. And was this a natural disaster, the leveling of the worst parts of New Orleans, or was this an intentional human-made one? The negligence was what apparently dominated, in that there were much higher rates of PTSD afterward than you would see with a regular old natural disaster. So, amygdala is very attuned to threat, to dread, to ambiguity, to uncertainty, and when it's being generated by somebody else as opposed to whatever's going on with the plate tectonics, it is that much more likely to be permanently marked, permanently traumatized by. So, the amygdala, we would now be thinking, does very, very logical things in terms of sensory inputs coming into it, which would be as follows. You, with your eyes, you see something scary, and the eyes send a projection into your, I told you this is the only time we're going to mention this part of the brain ever again, into the thalamus. The thalamus is a sensory sort of pathway here, shuttling place into what's called the lateral geniculate part of the thalamus. Ignore that. Goes from there to the visual cortex in the back of your head, to the first layer and the secondary there and tertiary and quaternary and then eventually gets shipped to your parietal cortex, which shifts it to your frontal cortex, which decides what to do about it, which is, oh my God, that's a gigantic, terrifying snake coming at me. Get alarmed. Amygdala, there's a snake coming at us. And this occurs at glacial speed. Glacial, like geologists, glacial, like 3/4 of a second. It takes forever for this to get to your amygdala saying it's an emergency. And what people discovered a while back, particularly this guy Joseph Ledoux, New York University, discovered there's a shortcut in the thalamus which then dives directly into the amygdala. And it gets into the amygdala in 50, 60, 100, it's 50, 60 thousandths of a second, 50, 60 milliseconds, in a fraction of your amygdala is getting the news that you are looking at something scary while this first visual layer here is farting around trying to remember how to have an action potential. You get a shortcut through here. Wow, that is great. And you get a shortcut in terms of scary sounds, a different part of the thalamus, all the shortcuts to your shortcuts, all of these. Your amygdala can find out about scary things a second before you're even consciously aware of what you're looking at. So this is a great piece of wiring there, and that's fantastic. It's obviously fantastic. What it means is by evolving that shortcut, you get like a half-second jump on running away from whatever it is. There's a downside. There's a massive downside, which is like, what's this useful for? This is this incredibly complicated process of hierarchically extracting information about what you're looking at so that you get an accurate picture of what it is you were looking at. The shortcut to the amygdala is great, it's really fast, but you give up all the quality control of the processing here. You get a message incredibly fast, but because this part of the brain and this part of the brain are not very good at like visual processing, extracting features or they're not very good at it. You get it really fast, but it is very often not an accurate picture of what you are looking at. So what are we beginning to describe here? This is the neurobiology of why, under certain circumstances, if you are already frightened enough, if you already have a history of this or that type of trauma, and you are looking at the right sort of person or wrong sort of person who is invoking all sorts of implicit alarms going off in you, and you've got a fraction of a second to respond, and this is the neurobiology of Over and over, you get a cop shooting an unarmed man who is one of the out-group members, where the cop says they were holding a handgun and they were holding a cell phone. And this has even been formally studied. A guy at the University of Colorado named Correll, who's a graduate of this class, has actually taken in police officers and looked at flashing up, trying to distinguish cell phones from firearms, and how long has it been since the police officer has slept, has eaten a meal, whose face is accompanying the picture of the object, all that sort of thing, and showing that the amygdala gets the news really fast and acts on it really fast while you're barely even aware. And depending on what biases have been built into it, it's going to be seeing cell phones as handguns. So this wonderful shortcut, which nonetheless can come back and bite you in the rear when you are not doing something as evolutionarily straightforward as trying to get a half-second jump on running away from a lion. Okay, so what's the role of the amygdala? It's acquiring fear, all of that. What's its role in forgetting, losing fear of something? And here's where we see our first amygdala frontal cortical interaction. So you fear a condition, an individual, a rat, whatever. You blink on a light and they get a shock, and you blink on a light and they get a shock, and you do it a bunch of times, and the organism learns eventually with Pavlovian conditioning that the light blinks on all by itself, there's no shock, and nonetheless their amygdala activates and their heart beats faster and they secrete stress hormones, and you have a conditioned fear response. Good. So that is what you have taught this organism today. Tomorrow, they come back and you put them back in the same setting and you flash up the light and oh my god, the amygdala activates and they swear but there's no shock. Light a second time, no shock. Over and over and over, light with no shock. And what you see is the amygdaloid response habituates, the cardiovascular response, the freezing behavior, whatever response, you are extinguishing the fear. Extinguishing the fear, and what you are learning today is different from what you learned yesterday. Yesterday you learned that bright light turning on is bad news and terrifying, and today you're learning, but not today. And the frontal cortex is sending an inhibitory projection down into the amygdala. It's the frontal cortex that is figuring out, but not today. Today, something's different. The light comes on, you don't get the shock, you don't get... How about you get less reactive? The frontal cortex drives this habituation, this extinction of this fear response. And what's the best evidence for this? You cut this projection and you don't get fear extinction. So, have you forgotten the trauma? Have you forgotten that red lights are scary when they flash on? No. Here's how you could show it. Okay, so the very first day, here's how many times you had to turn the red light on followed by a shock until red light all on its own would evoke a fear response. How fast would you condition an organism that takes this number of trials? So by now you flash on the light alone, you get a fear response, and the next day you don't get the shock anymore, so you extinguish it. And then on day 3, you put them back, and once again, the light comes on and you get a shock. And what you see is the fear response is acquired that much more rapidly than the first time, because you're not acquiring it the second time, you are reacquiring it. You still remember on day 1, your amygdala learns flashing lights are terrifying. On day 2, your amygdala is willing to go along with the frontal cortex saying, but not today. And on day 3, both the frontal cortex and the amygdala are saying, damn, it's this again. The flashing light is bad news again. You have not forgotten it on day 2. It's still in there and it gets pulled out more readily. It is reactivated. And a way of maybe phrasing that differently is we may reconcile and we may come to arbitration and come to peace with me. We may even forgive, but we sure don't forget. That stays in there. Okay, so we have a sense of the boring, delayed way in which exciting, scary sensory information eventually makes its way to the amygdala, the shortcut way, the way in which frontal information could come in telling you it's not scary anymore. And we've got all the circuitry from previously in the week and pape circuit and all of that. Who is the amygdala talking to? Who is it sending projections to? And we know this already. Some of what it's doing is it's projecting to the hippocampus, and we saw that the other day. It's projecting to a part of the brain called the locus coeruleus, which I haven't written out because it's impossible to spell it correctly. Locus coeruleus has to do with arousal. You were sitting there, you were half asleep during a lecture, and the person next to you suddenly screams and you suddenly become alert. That's because your amygdala has very rapidly processed that sound and told your locus coeruleus to activate, releasing your brain's equivalent of adrenaline, an arousing signal by way of the neurotransmitter rather than adrenaline, epinephrine, by noradrenaline. Norepinephrine releases norepinephrine all over the brain. You become aroused, you become alert. In a circumstance like that, your amygdala is also talking to your hypothalamus and activating the stress response by way of the sympathetic nervous system going down your spine, by way of stress hormones going through the pituitary. So that's the outflow when there's something suddenly arousing and alarming and all of that. Your amygdala talks to the parts of your brain that arouse your body, arouse your hormones, and arouse your sensory systems. What else? The amygdala, as I just said, talks to the hippocampus with a very interesting property. Normally, they're doing like totally different things. Mild stress messes up the sort of memory that the hippocampus forms, while mild stress enhances the memories that the amygdala make. They work in opposition in lots of ways until it is something that is highly stressful, when, as we saw, the amygdala, by way of that amygdalofugal pathway, takes over the hippocampus. What do I mean by this? During a highly traumatic event, the amygdala is filing away scary stuff. When we saw the outer core of the amygdala has a lot in common with the overall cortex. It's the outer core, the cortical part of the amygdala that learns new things to be afraid of, as opposed to the core, which has instinctual phobias, all of that. So the outer part of your amygdala is learning, this is terrifying. What's it need the hippocampus for in terms of hippocampus filing away memories as well? What it recruits the hippocampus to do is get contextual memory for what is scary. You are a rat and they put you in a novel cage, and every time the red light comes on, you're going to get a shock. Okay, you remember that. You remember at least two different components of this. You have a primary stimulus that you have remembered as a fear-evoking stimulus, the red light coming on. But a secondary one is when you're in that cage that you had never been in before that went on. And under those circumstances, the red light flashing on is processed by the amygdala. Being back in that cage is contextual fear conditioning processed by the hippocampus. And we can see this in us as well. You're in a dark alleyway at night where a scary person pulls a gun on you. And forever after, if you think about that gun, it is very likely the amygdala will activate. If you think about that gun and the face of that person, amygdala, hippocampus. But look at how this can shift. Forget the gun, now the face and the scary alleyway. This is now the most proximal cue, which is the amygdala. This is the more distal one. Context The face is the context for the scary gun. The alleyway is the context for the face, for the gun, and nobody quite understands how, but in terms of which stimuli you're presenting, this could jump from hippocampus when paired with this to jumping to amygdala when paired with the dark alleyway. So, amygdala pulling in the hippocampus with this. What else is the amygdala doing in terms of outputs? And one really, really interesting finding came out some years ago. This group, this guy, Antonio Damasio, who's one of the greatest neurologists around there, has done totally fascinating work. We're going to hear lots about that on the brain and emotion. Damasio got a hold of like one of the all-time interesting patients, and you will notice the pattern of these things. HM, known only by his initials HM. In this case, this person, she is only known by her initials SM, and SM suffers from Erbach-Weiss syndrome, which I had to write down, and I have no idea how it's actually pronounced that way. What's the deal with SM? She has some sort of calcium trafficking defect in her brain so that she got enormous deposits of calcium in her amygdalas, which destroyed her amygdalas. Only her amygdalas. You will see on the handout there is a brain scan of SM, and you could see these two crater holes where the amygdala would normally be, and everything else is fine. Why calcium accumulates only there, I have no idea. Incredibly rare. Presumably, Erbach was the one who discovered that you can have the left amygdala destroyed and vice the right amygdala. That some amygdala dating site, and the rest is history. So SM has no amygdalae. Her amygdalas were destroyed. And what does she look like? She's affable. She is friendly. She is extremely friendly. She is extremely trusting. She does not recognize scary things. She gets no amygdaloid response. She has no amygdaloid response. She has no neurological response. She has no cardiovascular response to watching something terrifying. She can tell it's exciting. Something tumultuous is happening here while she's watching some terrifying movie that's got everybody else like climbing the walls or whatever. She does not react physiologically, autonomically to scary things, to threatening things, to sad things. Back to the amygdala and depression the other day, all that, but she is perfectly responsive to funny things and happy things, and she describes herself as very happy, and everyone describes her as very outgoing, very open-hearted, very trusting, because she does not get feedback by way of the amygdala saying, this jerk just stabbed me in the back in the prisoner's dilemma game. Interestingly, something I find fascinating is that SM also has trouble recognizing music that is sad or menacing. Listening to the soundtrack from Jaws or whatever, she does not get the response that everyone was conditioned to way back when in the Dark Ages. She doesn't even do this for music. She recognizes happy music, moving music, joyous, triumphant, militaristic, whatever, but scary or sad doesn't register because she's got no amygdala. So that's interesting. One of the things about her is she's terrible at recognizing scary faces, sad faces, any sort of negative affect. She's fine recognizing happy faces, all of that, surprised ones. She's very bad at recognizing that. And Damasio's group did this fascinating study with her where they showed her all sorts of faces and what's the emotion you're seeing there. And she gets all the aggressive looking, scary ones wrong, all of that. And they did eye tracking on her while she was looking at faces. And as you have in your handout, some tracings from that study, like a landmark study, showing SM does something very different than everybody else does. When you look at a face in fractions of a second, what you're mostly looking at is the eyes and then the mouth. Mostly the eyes, the mouth is triangle of focusing. And what you see there in the handout is she doesn't look at the eyes. She looks at the nose, she looks at the cheek, whatever it is, and she's terrible at recognizing an angry, scary face. She's fine despite looking in all sorts of wrong places and recognizing happy faces and stuff. She doesn't recognize angry faces accurately, and she's not looking at the eyes. And what they showed in this study is when they instructed her only look at the person's eyes, only look at their eyes, she suddenly became accurate at detecting frightening faces. What did we just find out? Why don't her eyes look at eyes? Why isn't she get? Because it turns out part of what the amygdala does is tell your eye muscles where to look in a fraction of a second. Part of the amygdaloid output, like the output of a lot of parts of the limbic system, not only how you are going to respond to emotionally relevant stimuli, but how good you're going to be at acquiring the information. Are you oriented towards getting that information quickly and accurately? And remarkably, when you don't have the amygdala, you don't have instructions. When you look at a face, we really, really want to know quickly if it's scary and something's happening there. Don't forget, look at the eyes, look at the eyes. The notion that this limbic structure is affecting your ocular motor system around your eyes there in milliseconds time is remarkable in terms of seeing the output. Okay, finally, we know this already. The amygdala has a ton to say to the prefrontal cortex, which we will be getting to. Okay, another part of the brain, another part of the limbic system, in this case, kind of honorary limbic system structure, which we didn't mention the other day, is something called the insular cortex. And for 99% of beasts out there, insular cortex is totally boring. Here's what it does. You're a lab rat, you're a baboon, you're a slug, I don't know what. You bite into some piece of food that is totally disgusting and rotten and rancid and fetid and teeming with bacteria and all of that. This like really disgusting spoiled piece of food. You bite into it, and in 50, 60 milliseconds or so, this insular cortex activates. And what does it do? It sends a projection to the muscles in your throat and your mouth, and you gag and you spit out the food. If it's bad enough, your stomach lurches, you feel nauseous, you'll even throw up. It sends projections to your facial muscles, and you kind of squint as if you're protecting your eyes and your nose and stuff from this thing. And what's the insular cortex do? In every mammal out there, it detects disgusting tastes and disgusting smells. It does gustatory and olfactory responses, gustatory disgust. And what's that good for? Obviously, it evolved so that you're not eating something poisonous and you taste it and you spit it out, and hooray, isn't evolution great? So, somewhere back when we hominins started getting clever enough and smart enough that we could do something even more abstract, which is, as you look at the handout, take somebody, put them in a brain scanner, and you've convinced this volunteer and psych one to bite into something disgusting, and yeah, their insular cortex activates. And now instead, you just show them pictures of somebody eating something disgusting, like that bug, like that creature that person is jamming in their mouth while the insect is fighting with its little feet against the person's lips to try to get out, and you crunch down and you think, and oh my god, that's so disgusting. You activate the insular cortex. Aha! So, by the time you get to humans, not only does the insular cortex do gustatory disgust, it does thinking about gustatorially disgusting things as well. Whoa, amazing insular cortex we've evolved. But now you do something even more specific to humans. Stick the person in the scanner. They don't eat something disgusting. They don't look at pictures of people eating disgusting stuff. And instead, what you do is show them a picture of something incredibly upsetting, something morally upsetting, of some appallingly prejudicial, violent acts carried out on someone, something totally distressing in that way, totally morally disgusting. And the insular cortex activates. What have we just learned? For one thing, that the brain can function metaphorically, and we're going to see so much about that from here on out. Okay, so like, I don't know, 30,000 years ago, humans came up with the notion of moral norms that are so standardized that you could develop them into moral systems, morality, and thus norm violations that could be so horrible that they're really, really negative. Moral disgust. So they had a committee meeting, and as we know from the other day, evolution is not an innovator, it's not an inventor, it's a tinkerer. They sit there and say, well, we've had the insular cortex doing disgusting tastes for 100 million years or so. We can't build a new part of the brain right now. Gustatory disgust, sensory disgust, moral disgust, I don't know, they kind of sound the same. And shoehorn in, and suddenly the human insula gets its portfolio expanded, where it now just does sensory disgust and moral disgust as well. And for a neuron in the insular cortex, it cannot distinguish when you record from it, a la Wednesday, when it is getting action potentials, it cannot distinguish between a disgusting taste or a disgustingly damaging immoral act. It's all the same. So, why is that interesting? For one thing, once again, brains are just tinkerers, and we're going to see all sorts of parts of the brain that have worked out accommodating metaphorical versions of things alongside literal versions. And we will see that's essential to feeling somebody else's pain as if it is your own empathy. Other parts of the brain that are going to confuse the literal with the metaphorical. Okay, so the insula does this as well. It metaphorically cannot tell the difference between disgusting sensation and disgusting moral acts. That turns out to explain a lot. It explains why, if you hear about sufficiently appalling moral transgressions, it feels sick to your stomach. It makes you queasy. You may literally feel queasy. It leaves a bad taste in your mouth. It is a somaticizing of moral disgust. And it turns out this is actually a very adaptive, useful thing because, an awful lot of the time when you're looking at the immoral injustices in the world, the easiest cognitive thing to conclude is it's too big and I can't make a difference and I'm all on my own and someone else will take care of it. And what is this insular loop about moral disgust useful for? It sets your viscera on fire. It gives you a fire in your belly. It makes this moral transgression, instead of some abstraction you're going to write a paper about at the end of the quarter, it turns it into something that has you having to act right now. What the visceral impact of moral disgust is, by way of hijacking the insular cortex, is a way to galvanize us into action when righting a wrong is a pretty uphill battle and is not all that assured. So that's great. That's great. That's just as great as the amygdala getting a jump on your cortex and recognizing something scary. Hooray, evolution once again. And once again, there is a downside. Just as the amygdala getting this rapid information, the amygdala, with whatever implicit biases it has, is filtering that information and not being inaccurate and making potentially horrendous decisions as to what you are looking at, what you are hearing, things of that sort. Meanwhile, in the insular cortex, where moral wrongs are so viscerally activated, it's like your stomach is on fire, all of that. That's great. That's motivating. The downside is, if you decide that your litmus test for what is right and wrong out there is, does it seem disgusting? Does it seem disgusting? Because what we immediately know is one person's list of things that are simply disgusting behaviors is somebody else's list of individual differences and cultural differences and who you love and how you love them and what foods you eat and who you worship, but all of that, and deciding is something okay or not If it makes me feel queasy, if it feels disgusting to me, then it's wrong, 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 is a horrible litmus test. And there's sort of a conservative branch of bioethics. Oh, what is the guy? Leon Cass, University of Chicago, who has argued for, quote, the wisdom of repugnance. How do you tell if something is not morally okay? If it makes you puke, you must rebuke. If it makes you feel queasy, that's how you know it's wrong, wrong, wrong. And all we have to think about is all the ways in which moral disgust is a moving target and in the eyes of the beholder, and deciding how should you decide what is okay in the world, what should be legal, what should be sanctioned, what should be jailed for all of that. If it makes you disgusted, that's your litmus test. That is real dangerous. And Cass is very influential in sort of right-wing bioethics realms. He played a central role in the second George Bush administration in banning all sorts of fetal cell research having to do with it associated with it. It's disgusting to think that women are going to be flocking and paid to abort their fetuses so they can use cells. That's so disgusting. It should be outlawed. And he was the head of the bioethics committee that banned all sorts of fetal stem cell research during the Bush administration because his rule was the wisdom of repugnance. Moral disgust is a moving target, and deciding that if something different is disgusting, that's how you decide if it's wrong, wrong, wrong. That is a really dangerous precedent. And a psychologist, UPenn, named Paul Rozin, has argued that this is particularly slippery slope because what we often do first when contemplating a novel unknown them is look at their food customs, their what they do to their bodies, their appearance, things of that sort. And that's exactly the realm that your insula activates. Oh my God, they eat those things. They kill those things and eat them. They do this. They have all these rituals that are disgusting. And what that sort of emphasizes is how much sensory disgust in the insula is a stepping stone for the insula deciding about disgust on more abstract levels. If you decide those people eat disgusting things, have disgusting sexual practices, and before you know it, you've figured out those people have disgusting theologies or ideologies or philosophical stances or whatever, the insula as this very dangerous starting point. It is great for keeping you from getting poisoned in the next second. It is a very scary, unreliable source of being your moral compass, because disgust is a very good way from going from different to not okay, not allowable, worth persecuting, things of that sort. Okay, so we now at long last, turn to the frontal cortex. In particular, the most recently evolved part of it, way in the front, the prefrontal cortex. And we will soon be seeing sub areas of it that do very, very different things. But at last, we arrive at the prefrontal cortex. We've got more of it than any other species out there, or more complicated wiring when compared to other apes. It's the most recently evolved part of the brain. The cortex is the newest part of the brain. The frontal cortex is the newest part of the cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the newest part of the frontal cortex. It is spanking new, and as we will get to later on in the course, of massive significance. Most of you do not have a fully functional prefrontal cortex yet. It's the last part of the brain to mature, not until you are about 25 years old. Okay, so we have arrived at the prefrontal cortex. What is it about? Some of the time, it's doing totally mundane stuff. What is your prefrontal cortex? It's the decision maker. It makes executive decisions. And once it has made an executive decision affecting behavior, what is behavior? It's stuff you're doing with your muscles. Ooh, I just behaved in this way. Ooh, I just behaved in that way. And a lot of times the prefrontal cortex that's making the decision to do this or that or something, and the outflow of that is completely boring and straightforward. Your prefrontal cortex gets it into your head to do this and sends that message moving backward in your brain to the frontal cortex, to what's called the premotor cortex, to what's called the motor cortex, which then sends a command down your spine and causes your muscles to do something or other. Okay, so what does the frontal cortex do? It decides what behavior you're going to do right now and it makes you do it. Okay, so that is far and away the most boring thing about the prefrontal cortex. Of course, what this is dramatic foreshadowing to is what is really most interesting about is when it is talking to the limbic system and the limbic system is talking to it. Okay, so first, on a more abstract, on a cognitive level, what does the prefrontal cortex do? It makes you do the hard thing when that's the right thing to do. Long-term planning, self-control, gratification postponement, regulating your emotions, regulating your impulses. Aha! No wonder it is a recent human invention. No wonder we've got so much of it. No wonder it takes like a 30-year lifespan to get a fully mature frontal cortex. All of that is going to make much more sense as we explore what it does. But most broadly, what the prefrontal cortex does is it makes you do the hard thing when that's the right thing to do. So let's look at this within a cognitive realm. It's in charge of working memory. Working memory, you got to remember something for 30 seconds because you're adding numbers in your head and okay, file away this plus this equals this because you're going to have to multiply this by what this plus this equals. So keep that there, hold that temporarily. Working memory, frontal cortex is essential for that. A very different world than memories that you file away long term. So that what is also central to cognitively is executive function. Strategizing decisions about your knowledge. So this takes us back to the other day, hippocampus. Hippocampus isn't where you learn how to take something apart and put it back together without thinking about it, playing the piano pieces where you don't have to think about it, stuff that HM could still do. Hippocampus is about declarative memory, explicit memory. And what the executive function of the frontal cortex, the PFC, is about is working strategically with declarative knowledge from the hippocampus and working out strategies based on that. So here's an example. My wife was a neuropsychologist back when, and when she was in grad school, I always had to go. She tried out all her neuropsych tests on me, which were incredibly stressful and unsettling. And that was when I had even a younger brain, but there was one of these, it was called the CVLT, the California Verbal Learning Task. And what the person does is they sit you down and they say, okay, today I went to the market, I bought one plum, one loaf of bread, one hammer, like 1 second, go through 16 of them. And they say, okay, tell me what you bought at the market today. Oh my God, I can't remember what were the first two things and what's the last thing they said. And so you crawl gasping to the finish line, remembering maybe 3 of them or so. And then they do the same thing to you again. You said, yes, today I went to the market. I bought one plum, one loaf of bread, one hammer. They go through the same list again. What did I get at the market? And okay, this time instead of 3, you got 5 or 6. And you get a learning curve, an acquisition curve, which is very, very indicative of how well your hippocampus is working. But only on the second, third, 10th round of doing this or whatever, you begin to notice something. Oh, these 16 items, a quarter of them, 4 of them are fruit. 4 of them are hardware items, 4 of them are carbs or whatever. And what you see is somewhere 3-4 times into this exercise, you begin to categorize, you begin to clump your memory. Okay, fruits. Okay, and afterward, what did you get at the market? I remember 2 out of the 4 fruits. I remember 3 out of the 4 hardware items. You are beginning to have an executive strategy for how to organize that knowledge. You are beginning to think categorically, back to our very first lecture. And what you see is with different types of dementias, different types of neurological diseases, ones that are damaging the hippocampus, the speed with which you remember the items is greatly impaired. The accuracy, you bet, damage the prefrontal cortex, and you don't get the clumping, the putting into categories. You don't get that as a boost for your memory. So prefrontal cortex doing that, and that is right back to our first lecture. Ooh, why did this behavior occur? Prefrontal cortex says, oh, it's so much easier to just think like a behavioral geneticist or just think like an endocrinologist, or prefrontal cortex and categorical buckets and our whole salient ass theory. It's in the prefrontal cortex that you have those neurons where 60% of a dog looks more similar to 100% of a dog than 60% does to 40% of a dog, because this crossed a categorical boundary and distorts and exaggerates all of that. This is prefrontal cortex. So it is thinking categorically. What it also does is it's in charge of keeping you from doing some dumbass, impulsive cognitive thing. Like, for example, somebody sits you down and you say, okay, September, have you heard of September? Good, great, okay, so in the same boat here. September, quick, tell me the months of the year backwards. And you struggle, you go with September and August, and what comes next? No, not what comes next, what comes before. July, and then you go to June, if that's what comes next. All of that, and it's a struggle. It's a struggle because the more automatic, the more procedural, the more overlearned thing is September goes to October, which goes to November. No, no, no. Keep in mind, we're not doing that today. We're not doing it we're doing it backwards. We're doing it backwards. It's the prefrontal cortex that's in charge of saying, remember, today we're doing it differently. I know it's tempting to go from September to October. Don't do it. Don't do it. Remember, we're doing it backwards. Go in that direction. And what you see with certain types of dementias is that people have trouble inhibiting an overlearned response, inhibiting a habitual response. People have trouble doing that, and they'll say, okay, tell me the months in your backwards, and I'll say December, November, October, September, October, November, and it's like they slip in the ice and they just go in the other direction there. That's a marker of prefrontal damage with certain types of dementias. The prefrontal cortex makes you do the harder thing when it's tempting to do the easier thing. Today, the huge temptation is to go from August to September instead of going from August to July, and your prefrontal cortex is the one having to work really, really hard to keep that in place. You see another version of that. You, for example, say, okay, now start at number 20 and count backwards for me. And when you see somebody with prefrontal damage, they'll say, sure, 20, 19, 18, 17, September, October, November. Ooh, they just slipped in. They just got an intrusion from the previous task. Because if the prefrontal cortex is damaged, it's not there to say, we're not doing months anymore. We're not even doing months backwards. We're not doing months at all. We're doing numbers now. Don't say September when you start saying, say 16 instead. When it's damaged, you don't get that. So all sorts of inhibiting intrusions from easier solutions to cognitive tests. Now, the world's most crazy-making, stressful version of looking at this is the famed Stroop test. The Stroop test, where you are flashed up words of different colors, where the print is in different colors, and you were given this very difficult test. Quick, tell me, what color is this ink? Red. Easy. What color is this ink? Blue. What color is this ink? Blue. What color is this ink? Red. No, it's not red, it's blue. Ooh, during a Stroop test, it is very hard when you were told, when you look at this word, don't process the word as a word. Process the color of the ink. And people have tremendous problems being able to do a Stroop test under time pressure because there's this pull. Ooh, there's this prepared learning thing. There's this overlearned habitual response that when you look at something like this, you read the word, you don't say, oh, that's interesting, that's blue ink. You get pulled towards the reading. Stroop test, damage the prefrontal cortex, and people have horrible times handling the street test. Pickle the prefrontal cortex, as in during aging and as you get older, things like street tests are harder and harder to do because the prefrontal cortex is one of the hot spots in the brain for losing neurons with age, and it has a harder time saying, visual processing system, remember, don't read the word, just look at the color. Oops, you read the word, too late. And you fail the street test. Okay, so what the prefrontal cortex is also about is keeping you from generating horrendous faux pas. And this was this guy, the psychologist at Harvard, Dan Wegner, who died way too young some years ago of ALS. Dan Wegner, who looked at this phenomenon. And what did he call it? The mischievous imp of the unconscious or something or other, forgetting what it is, where you go into a party and you tell yourself, oh, this person's going to be there. And when I talk to them, remember, they just broke up with their significant other. Whatever you do, don't ask them what's up with their significant other because they just broke up and they're devastated by it. And don't faux pas that way. Don't do that. Make sure you remember. And when you do, you promptly go up and say, oh, hi, how is your cigar? Oh, my God, what is wrong with me? How is your spouse of 50 years? Ooh, they died last year, didn't you? Oh, that's right. Why do you have these hiccups like that? And what Wegner postulated and showed good evidence for was sort of a dual process model of you store two different pieces of information when you go into that party. The first one is something about that person and their relationship is really important. And the other piece is they broke up. And you walk in there, and normally the two pieces are working together just fine. There's something really important. Oh, yeah, they broke up. Do not mention the significant other, all of that. And during periods of stress and fatigue and all of that, your prefrontal cortex is a little bit distracted or sluggish, and the two pieces dissociate. And you come in, and I don't know, there's a 50-50 chance that you have put, there's something important going on with their partner and ask them about it, because maybe their partner just got 3 gold medals and that got dissociated from, they just broke up with a partner, and before you know it, you've asked them, oh, so how is, oh my God, what an idiot I am, because during periods of stress, these two pieces that are normally yoked together by the prefrontal cortex saying, the issue of them and their partner, not just that it's important, but it's important because they broke up, not important because they just got engaged or they just whatever, they just discovered they were identical twins separated at birth, some such thing, where the pieces come apart. And thus you walk in and you say, oh my God, I'm walking across like this fancy carpet and I'm holding this bowl of water for the dogs, and because I'm a house guest, whatever you do, don't spill any on the carpet. And of course you promptly spill it, and that according to Wegner, this is the prefrontal cortex during periods of stress has trouble binding together the two relevant pieces of information there. Now, finally, the most interesting thing remaining about the prefrontal cortex and its cognitive roles is, at some point, doing the right thing stops being the harder thing to do. Here's a great example of this. There was some point along the way where all of us had to master this prefrontally mediated feature of control of ourselves in a very critical way. That point way back when we learned if you need to pee, you don't necessarily pee. You hold it in. You hold it in because you have been toilet trained. You have learned to go to the bathroom and all of that. And maybe acquiring that piece of regulatory control involved reinforcements. And every time you successfully did that, your mother gave you M&Ms or some such thing. And what were you doing? You were strengthening a projection from the prefrontal cortex down to the part of your reptilian brain that controls contractions of your bladder. And you got potty trained and you learn not to pee just because you want to pee, and there's certain contexts for it that are appropriate, and hooray, and you're very, very baby step prefrontal cortex. As a 3-year-old, you've managed to do that. And what I'm willing to guess is very few of you right now listening to it are having to consciously think, don't pee, don't pee, don't pee. I'm sitting here. Worse if you're sitting here in a lecture hall with 500 people around you and you pee in your pants, but nonetheless, you're not having to consciously think. At some point, it stops being a doing the right thing when it's the harder thing to do task. It becomes automatic. You don't have to think about it anymore. And it stops being a frontal task, and it gets turfed to parts of your brain, like the cerebellum, for example, that are much more about implicit tasks, procedural tasks, tasks where metaphorically your hands or your bladder muscles know better than you do, where you don't have to think about it anymore. And we see this in all sorts of realms when something goes from being a explicit frontal task to an implicit procedural automatic one. You're learning the piece on the piano when here comes this hard part, and every time you play it, you teeter in those two measures there, or maybe you mess up and here it comes, here it comes. Remember, tuck my elbow in and lead with my thumb on this part and all of that, and you're thinking about it, and then one day you're playing the piece and you suddenly discover you're 4 measures past that spot, and it went fine, and you didn't have to think about it. And that's the day it stopped being a frontal task and it got transferred to a place like the cerebellum, which is much more about motoric, reflexive stuff. That's the first day it didn't still count as the harder thing. That's the day it became automatic. We will see all sorts of stuff about moral development in kids, and much as you don't have to think about don't pee in your pants anymore, at what point do some aspects of moral behavior become automatic? We will see an amazing study looking at that in a little bit. Okay, so all of that is giving us a sense now of the prefrontal cortex when it's doing cognitive stuff. What the frontal cortex, what the prefrontal cortex is mostly about is doing the harder thing in a social context. And here we get that hint that we proportionally have more prefrontal cortex or more complicated prefrontal cortex than any other primates. And it's amazing and it's big and it's metabolically really expensive. And we did not evolve that for counting the months of the year backwards rapidly. It was for social reasons. And some of the greatest insights into that came from the work of this anthropologist, where is he at? Oxford or Cambridge, Robin Dunbar, who discovered something marvelous. When you look across like 150 different primate species, what you see is, there's a lot of variation in the size of the brain. Apes had bigger ones than the monkeys. Monkeys had bigger ones than prosimians. We've had bigger ones than all the other apes. Okay, so brain size, brain volume, brain weight, all that sort of thing. But Dunbar focused then on a much more interesting measure. What percentage of your cortex is devoted to the prefrontal cortex? What percentage is doing the harder thing when it's the right thing to do sort of stuff? And what Dunbar noted was across 150 primate species, looking at that, the bigger the average size of the social group in the species, the larger the percentage of the cortex was devoted to the prefrontal cortex. Whoa! What did we just learn? We learned prefrontal cortical expansion during primate evolution was not driven by the need to say numbers backwards. It was driven by social mastery and social intelligence and doing the right thing when it's the harder thing to do in these social contexts. The bigger the primate social group, the more of your brain you were having to devote to this sort of thing. And this was shown beautiful follow-up study of taking a bunch of some kind of macaques, crab-eating macaques, not rhesus macaques, a bunch of monkeys, and individually housed, and they brain imaged them, and they saw how big the prefrontal cortex was. relative to the rest of the brain. And then they put these monkeys together in a social group for a year. They make different social groups of different sizes. And then you come back a year later and image the monkeys again, and being put into a social group from single housing caused an expansion of the prefrontal cortex. Ooh, how does that work? Brain plasticity, some of the catch-up stuff covered that. You make new projections, you make new neurons, you grow the space between neurons more for more cables, and all that. The prefrontal cortex expanded over the course of that year of living socially. And the bigger the social group these monkeys were put into, the bigger the expansion. What was that about? Suddenly, your prefrontal cortex had this enormously more taxing job than it used to have, requiring new synapses, new projections, all of that. What was it? It was having to figure out the right thing to do in a social context. And the more other participants in it, the more complicated it was likely to be. So, not only evolutionarily a pressure to evolve a bigger prefrontal cortex as sociality became more complex, but even brain plasticity within any of our own brains, increased social complexity expands this. What they also noticed was something very interesting in this study, which was who is the author? Salave, French group, published in Science or Nature. What they also noticed was in each of these social groups, the individual who became the alpha was the one who had the largest expansion of the prefrontal cortex. They did not do repeated measures to see which came first, the bigger prefrontal cortex with social dominance, and there's lots of reasons to think that each stimulated the other. But whoa, at the end of this process of having to upgrade your brain for dealing with sociality, the most socially significant, successful individuals in these social groups were the ones who had had the biggest upgrades. And this speaks to something very, very interesting about sort of social dominance and primates and all of that. And what was the classic view? Like, okay, you got a bunch of male primates, a bunch of male baboons. Who's going to be the highest ranking? It's going to be the biggest, most aggressive, most muscular guy with the biggest, sharpest canines. And number two in the hierarchy is going to be the one who's second biggest and second most aggressive. And you go and you study actual primates, real populations of them, and you see something much more subtle, which is attaining high rank. If you are, for example, a male baboon, attaining high rank is all about musculature and sharp canines and being aggressive and being a good savvy fighter and having lots of testosterone and initiating fights when it makes sense to do, and all of that. That's everything about who's going to wind up on top. But then you look at what's much more variable, which is how long do you stay on top? And there are some alpha males that will be there for unimaginable 2 years, and other ones who are gone a week later, and everything in between. Attaining high rank is all about winning critical fights. Maintaining high rank is all about social intelligence. It's all about which coalitions you form, which ones you don't go anywhere near, who you groom, who you don't bother grooming, who you're nice to, who you dump on when you're in a bad mood, and probably most importantly of all, maintaining high status among baboons is all about not which fights do you win, which fights do you avoid? Which provocations do you walk away from? Because if every provocation provokes a fight, at some point somebody's going to break your arm and then you're finished or some such thing. But mainly what we see a picture of is for an alpha male baboon, if you're having a lot of fights, that means you're on the way out. If you are having to use it, you are in the process of losing it. What it is overwhelmingly about is which provocations to ignore. When you do the harder thing, even though it's tempting to just leap at this guy and slash his face open because he's being all upstarty to you or whatever, and express him in that way, and it's the self-control to ignore provocations. And once you have an alpha male who is settled in stably, he doesn't get into any fights anymore. He doesn't have high testosterone levels anymore because if he's really on top of what he's doing, he doesn't have to have fights. He just stares at someone for 10 seconds and that's taken care of. No threat there. Once you get high ranking, you're maintaining it by social intelligence and psychological intimidation and bluff and all of that. And that's all about the prefrontal cortex. So primate evolution, primate self-control, a subset of species, social species, have what are called fusion-fission organizations. They spend part of their time together in a group and part of the time dispersed in pairs or individually, and they move back and forth with this. Classic example of this are wolves. Wolves go out and they hunt as individuals. They hunt rabbits and things like that. They scavenge as a group on like a caribou carcass or whatever. Hyenas are another fusion-fission group. They hunt in groups, but they scavenge individually. So on any given day, your hyena pack or your wolf pack, or to a lesser extent baboons and some other primates, other types of baboons as well, will go between aggregate group behavior and then distributed. They fuse, they fission back and forth. And what you see in those species, you really have to have a lot of social smarts, and they have particularly complex vocalization systems that are meant to be long distance, where part of each day or frequently or whatever, you're all scattered out over huge distances. These are the species that get vocalizations that could be heard miles away. Wolf calls, hyena vocalizations, they could be heard for miles, which is just staying in touch with everybody during the day so that everybody knows that everybody is still sort of out there. And later in the day, let's make sure nothing changed while we were all scattered today. So what does it look like when you get damage to the prefrontal cortex? Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage, I'm assuming most of you have heard about Phineas Gage, but once again, everyone needs to sit their grandchild on their knee at some point and tell them about Phineas Gage. We raised our kids with actually a kid's book about Phineas Gage that exists out there. Phineas Gage was working on a railroad construction line in Vermont. And something or other, you do something with dynamite if you're blowing holes in this mountain that you're building the railroad through, whatever. But somebody messed up and he was walking around and he had this long metal tamping rod that apparently like you use to flatten the TNT that you're using as an explosive, or I don't know, something. Somebody forgot to do something or other and he tamped one of them, and this piece of TNT exploded and drove this iron rod, this 3-foot long iron rod that weighed 13 pounds, up through Phineas Gage's eye and out the front of his skull and landed 50 feet away and took his frontal cortex with it. Whoa! Phineas Gage, this thing had gone through fast enough of an explosion, the metal hot enough that it cauterized all the blood vessels as it went through. So he wasn't even bleeding much. He's sort of like, oh, Gage, and they got him up and they said, what happened? And all the guys stood around and like they looked up there and they said, whoa, you got a big hole in your head now and all of that. And Gage was conscious. And it was decided that they should go into town and find the town doctor to have the doctor diagnose what had gone on. So Gage gets into a wagon, and in fact, he winds up walking somewhere. He's just got this like thing there. And they get to the town doctor who looks in there and diagnoses him. He says, whoa, Gage, you got a big hole in your head there, whatever. And what became renowned, famous in every textbook and song and myth forever after is Gage was utterly transformed in his personality. To use the words of that doctor who wound up following Gage for the rest of his life in the doctor's notes was, Gage was no longer Gage. Phineas Gage had been the foreman of this railroad. accomplished guy, stable, respected guy, sober, reliable, church-going, all of that. And in the aftermath of having his prefrontal cortex destroyed, Gage became disinhibited. He became sexually menacing. He became abusive. He became profane and foul-mouthed, and he wasn't able to show up to work. And it was years and years before he was ever able to hold a job again. Gage stopped being Gage. All of the doing the harder thing because it's the right thing to do had gone out the window. And Gage wound up being the very first frontally damaged patient, frontally disinhibited patient. Part of what's fascinating about him is he did slowly get better. Decades later, he was able to hold down a steady job, slow neuroplastic recovery of some function there. But between his accident and then, he worked as a circus freak performer, and the only known picture of Phineas Gage is him sitting there in front of a circus tent holding the iron pole there, which was his display item. He eventually died of a seizure. He had a seizure disorder in the aftermath, having a lot to do with the damage there, killed him. And you could now go see Phineas Gage's skull and the metal rod at Harvard Med School's library. It's on display there. And as you see in the handout, you could even go on Etsy and get a plastic replica of Phineas Gage's skull. So you can go see it there, and people have done reconstructive stuff showing the angle of the entry wound and the exit wound. Yes, it took out a large part of his prefrontal cortex, all of that. So that's where Phineas Gage's skull is. Where is the rest of Phineas Gage? He is right near all of us right now in Colma, just outside South San Francisco. He was buried in San Francisco. His mother lived there, which is where he went and died about 20 years after his accident. He was buried in San Francisco. At some point, they needed to, I don't know, get some housing developments going on there. So they dug up all the cemeteries in San Francisco and moved them all to Colma, City of the Dead. Go hang out there sometime if you want to be unnerved at what suburbia could look like when it's made of nothing but trees. But you can go see Phineas Gage's grave there in Colma, minus the head, which is still back in Cambridge. But at least we here, the Harvard of the West, we at least have the rest of the skeleton to make claim to. Now, what does this look like? In some other realms, you see this, a type of neurological disease, not Alzheimer's disease, but something called frontotemporal dementia, which is where the damage starts in the prefrontal cortex. And people, when they are first getting Alzheimer's disease, oh my God, grandma got lost driving back from the market today. Ooh, this is beginning to be worrisome. Watch that. Oh my God, grandma today said something totally inappropriate and disinhibited. This person beginning to get frontotemporal dementia exposed themselves in public, said something about whatever. The first things you see are not memory related, but they are disinhibited. 80-year-olds who are beginning to get frontotemporal dementia very quickly see a neurologist. 40-year-olds who are getting frontotemporal dementia are much more likely at first to see police officers or judges or psychologists until they figure out, oh, neurological damage happening here, disinhibition. Something else to contemplate with this, an astonishing percentage, depending on the study, anywhere from 25 to 75% of the people on death row in this country have a history of concussive head trauma that damaged the prefrontal cortex. Consider that when you have to decide to assess somebody's actions within a moral framework or a neurobiological mechanistic one. Most people on death row have a history of damage to a part of the brain that makes you do the hard thing when it's the right thing to do. And these are almost always people who were there because at some critical juncture or junctures, they didn't. Final piece of this, when you see damage to the prefrontal cortex, do you get somebody who's just crazy disinhibited and they're just saying outrageous things and they're robbing stores left and right and disrobing and all sorts of stuff like that? No, you see something much more interesting. You see a context dependency to the disinhibition. so that somebody with extensive damage to the prefrontal cortex can sit there and they seem perfectly fine. You ask them for advice. You ask them for advice about something you're tempted to do, and you're wondering if you should, and they'll give you great self-regulated advice. You know what? No, it's tempting, but you're gonna be happier in the long run if you don't do. They give wonderful advice about regulating your behavior and impulses to somebody else. They even do a pretty good job with it themselves under some circumstance that's not emotionally arousing. But as soon as there is arousal, agitation, stress, fatigue, as soon as the stakes are very high and emotional, that's when all of the self regulation goes out the window. For example, here's a task you might do with somebody with prefrontal damage and they're really hungry and you say, okay, you're like craving chocolate right now. Here in this hand I have 5 pieces of M&M. I have 5 M&Ms, and in this hand I have 1 M&M. Here's the deal. If you reach for the 5, I'm going to snatch my hand away and you'll get 1 M&M as a reward. If instead you reach for the 1 M&M, you'll get 5 as can you regulate your behavior over the next 3 seconds? And what you see is if the person is hungry enough or they have damage here, they can verbalize. They will sit there and say to you, oh, I know what you're up to. I know you want me to reach for the one with 5 because I'm not going to be able to keep myself from doing it. I know I'm going to reach this time. I'm going to go for the one here. And then they go for the wrong one. Final factoid to file away for your dream life tonight is: when is your prefrontal cortex the most silent in your brain ever, ever, ever? When you're in REM sleep. When you're in REM sleep, prefrontal cortex goes silent, and that's why dreams are dreamlike, and you do all sorts of bizarre things in your dreams where you would die if you ever did that in public because your limbic system is just running amok at that point without the prefrontal cortex, which is sound asleep saying, I wouldn't do that if I were you. No, this is only a dream. This is reality. We will pick up on Monday what happens when you are trying to exercise self-control over your prefrontal cortex, and what does the neurobiological picture look like with different strategies of self-control.